He said it loud enough for the whole store to hear. Elena Harrow? Chester Vance laughed, leaning against the counter like he owned it, because his father practically did. Marry her? A man would have to be blind, broke, and desperate all at the same time. He looked her straight in the face when he said it. Not behind her back. Not in whispers. To her face, in front of every soul in Blackstone Hollow who happened to be buying flour or thread that Tuesday morning. Elena didn't drop the ledger she was holding. She didn't cry. She just stood there with ink on her fingers and dust on her boots, and she said quietly, "The flour order is short by 40 pounds, Chester. Your father will want to know." And then the door opened. Walt Bassem. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, stay with me, because this story is about what happens when one woman refuses to believe it. Subscribe to this channel and follow Elena's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning Chester Vance humiliated Elena Harrow in front of half the town, she had already been awake for 4 hours. That was the thing nobody knew about her, the thing nobody bothered to find out. While the rest of Blackstone Hollow was still sleeping off Saturday night, Elena was at the back table of her father's store by 4 in the morning, working through freight invoices by lamplight, because the numbers from Caldwell County didn't add up and hadn't added up in 3 months. She had a headache that had been sitting behind her left eye since Wednesday. Her back hurt from the chair. She'd eaten half a biscuit for breakfast and called it enough. She was 28 years old, and she had been running the books for Harrow General Store since she was 19, the year her mother died and her father's hands started shaking too badly to hold a pen steady. Nobody had asked her to do it. She'd just done it. The way she did most things, quietly, without ceremony, and without expecting anyone to notice. Blackstone Hollow noticed very few things about Elena Harrow. What they noticed was what she wasn't. She wasn't pretty in the way the frontier valued pretty. She didn't have Mabel Croft's golden curls or the easy smile that made men tip their hats. She was narrow-shouldered and serious-faced, with eyes that tracked a room too quickly and a habit of pausing before she answered questions that made people think she was slow when she was actually the opposite. Her clothes were plain because plain was practical. Her hair was pinned because pinned stayed out of her way. She wore her intelligence like a working tool, not an ornament, and in Blackstone Hollow, that was close to invisible. So nobody was watching her when Chester Vance came into the store that morning. Chester was 26, broad across the shoulders, and absolutely certain the world owed him something generous. His father, Randall Vance, owned the only bank in a 40-mile radius, and Chester had grown up understanding that money made men tall. He came in for tobacco, or pretended to. What he actually came in for was the audience, because there were already 6 or 7 people in the store at that hour, ranchers picking up supplies before the sun got serious, and Chester liked an audience. He was talking about the upcoming Founders' Day social, who was taking whom, which women were worth dancing with, the usual nonsense that Elena had learned to tune out the way you tune out wind. She was at the counter updating the receivables ledger when she heard her name. "Some of the boys were wondering," said Dale Pruitt, a ranch hand who laughed too loud and thought too little, "whether Harrow's daughter was going to the social this year on account of she's still unattached." Chester looked over at her. She felt his look the way you feel something cold. "Elena Harrow?" He said her name like it was a punchline he'd been warming up to. "Marry her? A man would have to be blind, broke, and desperate all at the same time." The store went quiet. Not the polite quiet where people pretend not to hear. The real quiet, where every person in the room holds their breath because they want to hear what comes next, and they're glad it isn't happening to them. Elena felt her face go warm. Not with tears. She was past the age where Chester Vance could make her cry, but with something harder and older and more familiar. The heat of being reduced, of having someone look at your whole life, every early morning and unpaid hour and private sacrifice, and see nothing worth remarking on except your face. She set the ledger down flat on the counter. Her hand didn't tremble. "The flour order is short by 40 pounds, Chester," she said. "Your father will want to know." It wasn't a comeback. It wasn't a weapon. It was just the truth sitting right there, and she offered it the same way she offered everything. Plainly. Chester blinked. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected tears, or red cheeks, or the dropped eyes of a woman who'd accepted what he thought she was. He got none of those things, and it irritated him down to the bone. He was opening his mouth to say something worse when the front door of the store opened and the light came in around a tall man's shoulders. Gideon Ashcroft didn't make an entrance. He was the kind of man who walked into rooms the same way he walked across his own land, like the space already belonged to him and he had no particular opinion about it. He was 41, weathered in the way that outdoor work weathers a face, not beaten down, but carved into something specific. He was the largest landowner in the county, which meant most people in that store either worked for him directly or depended on someone who did. He stopped just inside the door and took in the room with one long, quiet look. Elena watched his eyes move. She'd seen that kind of assessment before, in men who were paying attention to more than they let on. Chester recovered fast. "Mr. Ashcroft, didn't know you were in town." "I'm not officially," Gideon said. He walked past Chester without slowing down, which was the kind of thing that happened to Chester more often than he liked. He stopped at the counter, not across from Chester, across from Elena. "Miss Harrow," he said, "I'd like a word." Chester made a sound. Not quite a word. More the noise a man makes when he realizes he's been stepped over without ceremony. Elena looked up at Gideon Ashcroft. She'd seen him before, the way you see anyone in a small town, across a street, at a distance, through a window. She'd never spoken to him directly. "Of course," she said. Gideon reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He set it on the counter between them. 3 years ago," he said, "there was a freight discrepancy on the Caldwell County route. 6 carriers, false manifests, county records showing deliveries that never happened. You found it." Elena looked at the paper. It was a copy of her original report, the one she'd filed with the county clerk because she hadn't known what else to do with it. She'd been 25. Nobody had told her to investigate anything. She'd just found numbers that didn't behave and followed them until she understood why. "It was a 4-month pattern," she said. "Once you see the structure, it isn't complicated." "My freight was in that route," Gideon said. "You saved me $1,100 and probably a contract with the Territory Rail Commission." She hadn't known that. "I didn't know your freight was involved." "I know you didn't." He folded the paper and put it back in his coat. "That's part of why I'm here." He told her what he needed. Not a housekeeper, not a secretary. A full-time bookkeeper and financial manager for Ashcroft Ranch, which was not one ranch but 7 working properties spread across the county, with 42 full-time employees, seasonal contracts, a cattle operation, and a grain concern that ran year-round. The previous man who'd managed the accounts had died of a heart attack in November, and Gideon had been managing the books himself since then, which meant the books hadn't been managed at all. He described the situation with the blunt honesty of someone who found embarrassment less useful than accuracy. "It's a 6-month commitment minimum," he said. "Room and board at the main house. Salary negotiable, but fair." Elena was aware that the entire store was listening. She was aware of Chester Vance standing 10 feet away with a look on his face she couldn't quite categorize. She was aware that her father was in the back room and that the cost of his medicine had gone up twice in the last year, and that the store was not, no matter how carefully she ran the numbers, going to carry them through another winter without something changing. She was also aware of what this looked like. An unmarried woman accepting live-in employment on a widower's ranch. She could already hear the talk, the way it would move through town like weather. She looked at Gideon Ashcroft and made a decision. "I'll need to make arrangements for my father's care," she said, "and I'll need access to every document from the last 4 years. Not just what's been filed, everything, including loose receipts and verbal contract notes if any were written down." Gideon studied her for a moment. "That's a very specific condition." 4 years is long enough for a pattern to develop," she said. "If there are problems in your accounts, I'm not going to find them by starting at the surface." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "1 week to make your arrangements," he said. "I'll send a wagon." He left the store the same way he'd entered it, without flourish, without looking back at Chester Vance, without any apparent interest in the reaction he'd left behind. The reaction was considerable. Chester waited approximately 4 seconds before he laughed. "Well," he said, and the word was loaded, "that explains itself, doesn't it?" Elena didn't answer him. She opened her ledger back to the receivables page and picked up her pen. "I'm noting the flour shortage here," she said to no one in particular. 40 pounds, Vance account, Tuesday morning. She wrote it down. Chester left. The rest of the store slowly exhaled and returned to its business. In the back room, through the thin wall, Elena could hear her father coughing. She kept writing. She told her father that evening. Sat across from him at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, the same table where she'd learned to read invoices when she was 12, where her mother had taught her to double-check every column twice because a single wrong number could ruin a month. Her father, Thomas Harrow, was 61 and looked 70. The lung sickness had come on 3 winters ago and hadn't left. He was a small man who had once been vigorous. She remembered that version of him, the one who'd carried feed sacks without thinking twice and laughed with his whole chest. What was left of him now still had the same eyes, sharp and dark, still reading her face the way he always had. "Ashcroft Ranch," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "People are going to talk." "People already talk," she said. "They talked this morning before I'd even agreed to anything." "Elena, Papa." She said it gently but firmly. "Mrs. Greer will check on you twice a day. I've already spoken to her. Dr. Feldman says the new syrup is working, and it costs 4 times what the old one did, and we cannot afford it by spring if something doesn't change." He looked at the table. He was proud in the way of men who'd built things with their hands and hated needing help. "I don't want you going out there to save me," he said. "I'm not," she said. "I'm going out there because I'm good at something and someone with sense finally noticed. You just happen to benefit." He looked up at her, and she saw something cross his face, something she hadn't seen in a long time. Not gratitude, not worry, pride. The real kind. "Your mother would have laughed at Chester Vance," he said. "Mama would have made him feel terrible in 8 words or less," Elena said. "I take longer." Thomas Harrow smiled. It was small and tired and real. "You take longer, but you do more damage," he said. She'd be proud of that too. Elena packed 1 bag. She took her ledger tools, her ink, 2 changes of clothes, her mother's small silver watch, and a mathematics reference book with a broken spine that she'd read so many times it fell open to the right pages on its own. She did not take anything she couldn't afford to lose. That was a rule she'd made for herself years ago and had never found reason to break. The wagon arrived 6 days later, driven by a ranch hand named Pete, who had the social instincts of a fence post and spoke in complete sentences only when directions were involved. Elena appreciated him immediately. The road to Ashcroft Ranch took the better part of a morning. Somewhere around the 2nd hour, Pete said, without looking at her, "Folks at the ranch don't know what to make of you coming." "What do they think?" she asked. He considered this for a long time. "Most of them think you're either after Mr. Ashcroft's money or his name. Maybe both." "And what do you think?" Another long pause. "I think Mr. Ashcroft doesn't do things without a reason," he said. "So there's probably a reason." "There is," Elena said. Pete nodded and said nothing else, and Elena found that satisfying. The first thing she noticed about Ashcroft Ranch, the main house, the property they called the home ranch, was how big it was and how much of it looked like it was fighting itself. Outbuildings in varying states of repair, a bunkhouse that needed new boards on the south wall, fences that were sound but gates that sagged. It had the look of a place that had been well built and then run, hard, without anyone standing back to look at the whole picture. She filed that away. A ranch that looked like this had financial decisions that looked like this too. The second thing she noticed was the man standing on the porch of the main house. He wasn't Gideon Ashcroft. He was older by a decade, wide through the middle, with a face that had settled into an expression of permanent authority. He wore his clothes like someone who'd chosen them deliberately. Not fancy, but arranged. Controlled. He came down the porch steps at a pace that told her he'd decided when this conversation was going to begin, not her. "Miss Harrow," he said. "I'm Silas Cobb. I manage the day-to-day operations of the ranch." "Mr. Cobb," she said, Mr. Ashcroft asked me to get you settled." He said it smoothly, hospitably. "I'll show you the office. The books are—" He paused. "In some disarray." "I expected that," she said. "We all have our own ways of doing things here," he said. "The ranch has systems that work, even if they don't look like much on paper. I'm sure you'll find your footing once you understand how things actually run." Elena looked at him. He was smiling. It was a warm smile, an experienced one, the smile of a man who was used to being liked and had figured out exactly how to make that happen. Of course, she said. She followed him inside and said nothing else, but she was thinking very precisely about one particular thing he'd said. We all have our own ways of doing things here. In her experience, that sentence meant one of two things. Either the speaker was protecting a good system from outside interference, or they were protecting themselves from scrutiny. She didn't know yet which one it was, but she intended to find out. The office was a converted sitting room off the main hallway, and it looked like a paper avalanche had been frozen in progress. There were stacks of invoices on every flat surface, ledger books open to random pages and stacked on top of each other, loose receipts scattered among proper filed documents with no apparent organizing principle. On the wall was a calendar from 2 years ago. Elena stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she put down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and started reading. She didn't organize anything. Not yet. When you organized first, you lost the shape of the disorder, and the shape of the disorder was information. She moved through the stacks slowly, reading dates, reading amounts, reading names of vendors and suppliers and contractors, not looking for anything specific, just letting the picture form. By the time Gideon Ashcroft appeared in the doorway at noon, she had covered every surface with her own preliminary notes and was standing in the middle of the room looking at 3 different invoices held up in the light from the window. "You haven't sorted anything," he said. "Not yet." He leaned against the doorframe. He had a cup of coffee in his hand that he'd clearly forgotten was there. "Most people start by organizing. Most people lose what they're looking for that way," she said. She set 2 of the invoices down and kept the third. "When did you last do a physical inventory of the grain concern?" He thought about it. "October." "What was the count?" He told her. She looked at the invoice in her hand. She looked at her notes. "There's a discrepancy between your October count and the purchase orders from August through September," she said. $4,300 in grain that was ordered, paid for, and doesn't appear in the inventory. The cup of coffee stopped halfway to his mouth. "That's a 3-month-old discrepancy," he said carefully. "Yes. Could be a recording error." "It could be," she said. "I'd like to see the delivery manifest from those months." He looked at her steadily. She noticed he didn't tell her she was wrong. He didn't say she'd misread something. He didn't explain it away the way people did when they were uncomfortable with what you'd found and wanted you to be less right. He just said, "I'll have them pulled." She nodded and went back to her invoices. And in the hallway, where neither of them could see him, Silas Cobb stood with his hand on the wall and his smile entirely gone. That night, Elena sat on the edge of the narrow bed in her assigned room and wrote a letter to her father, told him the room was decent, told him Pete the driver was good company in small doses, told him the books were a wreck, but an interesting one. She didn't tell him about the $4,300. She didn't tell him about Silas Cobb's smile. She didn't tell him that when she'd gone back to the stack of invoices at 4 o'clock to pull the delivery manifests Gideon had asked about, 3 of them were missing. Documents don't walk off on their own. She knew that. She'd always known that. But knowing a thing and being ready for what it means are 2 different matters entirely, and Elena Harrow sat in the dark of her first night on Ashcroft Ranch and understood, with the quiet clarity that had always been her most reliable quality, that she had ridden into something considerably more dangerous than disorganized bookkeeping. She picked up her pen. She turned to a fresh page in her private notebook, the one she'd brought from home, the one nobody knew existed, and she started writing down everything she'd seen. She had been at Ashcroft Ranch for 11 days before she found the second set of numbers. Not a second ledger, nothing so obvious. It was a pattern, the kind that only appeared when you read across documents instead of down them, when you treated 4 different record books as one conversation instead of 4 separate ones. Elena had spent the better part of her first week just getting the papers into a shape she could think inside of, organizing without losing the original disorder, which meant she'd made herself a map first. Dates, amounts, vendors, initials, on a long sheet of brown paper she'd tacked to the wall behind the office door where nobody walking past in the hallway could see it without stepping fully into the room. On the 11th day, she stepped back from that map and looked at it from across the room, the way you'd look at a painting, and something in her chest went very still. The numbers weren't wrong. That was the elegant part. Every individual entry was correct, every total balanced, every receipt matched a corresponding payment. If you looked at any single ledger, any single month, any single vendor account, you found nothing out of place. Silas Cobb's record-keeping was impeccable on its surface. But Elena didn't look at surfaces. She looked at timing, and the timing was telling her something that the numbers themselves couldn't say outright. Every third shipment from 3 specific vendors, a grain supplier out of Millfield, a livestock feed company registered in the next county, and a fence material supplier she'd never heard of called Terrence Brothers, arrived on paper 2 to 3 days before it arrived in the ranch's physical inventory logs. 2 to 3 days of lag that nobody had ever noted or questioned. 2 to 3 days in which goods existed on the books, but not in the world. The amounts were never large. Never large enough to cause a sharp intake of breath. Never large enough that Gideon, running 7 properties and 42 employees and trying to do the books himself in the wake of a dead accountant, would have stopped and asked a pointed question. $112 here, $87 there. $230 on one occasion, but that one had been buried inside a legitimate large purchase that made the total look reasonable. Over 4 years, it came to somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. Elena sat down in her chair and looked at the ceiling. $8,000 to $12,000 was not a small number. In Blackstone Hollow, it was the cost of a house, 2 years of a working man's wages, a life rebuilt from nothing. It was also, she recognized with a particular coldness, exactly the kind of sum that was large enough to give someone power and small enough to never get them caught. She didn't write the number on her brown paper map. She wrote it in the private notebook she kept locked in the bottom of her bag, the one she brought back to her room every evening, the one that didn't leave her person. Then she got up, put on her coat, and went to find Gideon Ashcroft. She found him at the fence line of the south pasture, not because she knew he'd be there, but because she'd started paying attention to his patterns the same way she paid attention to everything, methodically, without making it obvious. Gideon spent his mornings at the main house and his afternoons moving between properties. And on days when the weather turned cold before noon, he ended up at the south fence because the wind came from the wrong direction on every other side, and a man could think in that particular corner without his hat blowing off. I was leaning against a post when she found him, not doing anything in particular, which she'd learned was how he looked when he was actually thinking hardest. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not at the house." He looked at her. The cold had put color in his face. "That specific?" "Yes." He turned and looked out at the pasture for a moment, then back at her. "Walk with me." They walked south along the fence line, far enough that the house was a small shape behind them, and Elena told him what she'd found. Not with alarm in her voice, not with the performance of someone delivering dramatic news. She'd learned a long time ago that alarm made people defensive, and defense made people stop listening. She told him the way she'd tell him about a column that didn't add, "Here's the fact, here's what it means, here's what I don't know yet." When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she counted fence posts in her head to keep from filling the silence. "Silas has been with this ranch for 19 years, he said finally. "I know. He was my father's steward before he was mine." "I know that too." "Are you certain?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I'm certain enough that I don't want to be wrong," she said, "which means I need more access than I currently have. The delivery logs from Terrence Brothers specifically. I've only seen them for 2 of the 4 years. If someone wanted to slow down a discovery, pulling the older records would be the efficient way." He looked at her sharply. "You think someone's anticipated you?" "I think someone's been doing this for 4 years without getting caught," she said. "That kind of person plans ahead." Gideon turned and looked back at the house again. From this distance, it looked orderly and solid and permanent, which Elena had started to understand was one of the things that made Ashcroft Ranch such a comfortable place to steal from. Nobody expected trouble in a place that looked like that. "Don't tell anyone what you found," he said. "Not yet." "I wasn't going to," she said. "Not even Pete." "Especially not Pete," she said. "Pete can't keep a secret from his horse." Something crossed Gideon's face. Not quite a smile. The shape that a smile makes before a man decides it's not the right moment. "What do you need?" "Access to the storage manifests from all 7 properties, not just the home ranch. And I need them brought to me directly, not through the main office." He nodded. "I'll do it myself." "One more thing," she said. "I need you to act like I found nothing. If whoever is doing this thinks I'm getting close." "Understood." He said it without her having to finish the sentence, and she appreciated that. There was a particular kind of efficiency to talking to Gideon Ashcroft that she hadn't expected and couldn't quite put a name to. He didn't perform listening, he just did it. They walked back toward the house on opposite sides of the fence path, not talking, which was also something she'd noticed about him. He didn't fill quiet with noise for the sake of seeming comfortable, and neither did she. And there was something in that shared habit that felt like the beginning of an understanding. On the porch, Silas Cobb was talking to one of the hands about something to do with the water troughs in the north field. He glanced up when they approached. His face was pleasant and open and showed no particular interest in where they'd been or what they'd discussed. "Miss Harrow," he said, "how are the books coming along?" "Slowly," she said. "There's more to sort through than I expected." He nodded sympathetically. "The previous man had his own system. It'll take time to make sense of it." "It usually does," she said. She went inside, and in the hallway she stopped, her back to the front door, and breathed once, steadily. He'd said the previous man had his own system. That was the third time in 11 days he'd found a way to attribute the confusion in the books to the dead accountant. The dead man couldn't argue. The dead man couldn't clarify. The dead man was a very convenient explanation. She went to the office and closed the door and sat at her desk and opened the ledger she'd been working in that morning. She picked up her pen, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Ashcroft Ranch, Elena Harrow understood that she wasn't just doing a job anymore. She was doing something that had a genuine capacity to go wrong in ways she hadn't fully prepared for. She was scared. She noted that fact about herself with the same honesty she applied to numbers. Not paralyzed, not backing down, just scared. Because she was one woman in an unfamiliar place, and the person she suspected had 19 years of relationships and trust built into every corner of this ranch, and nobody was going to believe her without something airtight. She needed to build something airtight. She turned to a fresh page and started building. The town started talking about her on day 14. She knew because Pete came back from a supply run looking like a man who'd been told something he didn't know how to put down. "Something I should know about?" she asked when he came in with the flour she'd requisitioned. "People talk," he said. "Pete." He set the flour on the table and looked somewhere past her shoulder. "Folks in town are saying you came out here for reasons that aren't professional." She absorbed that. "What kind of reasons?" "The romantic kind," he said, unhappily. She'd expected it. She'd expected it from the moment she'd accepted Gideon's offer in the store with Chester Vance listening. She knew how it looked. Unmarried woman, widower's ranch, live-in arrangement, in Blackstone Hollow. That narrative wrote itself before the wagon even left town. "What else?" she said. Pete shifted. "Chester Vance is telling people that Gideon felt sorry for you, that it's charity." She picked up her pen. "Thank you for telling me." "Does it bother you?" She thought about that honestly. There was something that burned, yes. Not at Gideon, not at Pete, but at the efficiency of it, the way a woman could do precise, difficult, skilled work and still have the story around her reduced to who she might be sleeping with or who felt sorry for her. It burned the way cold burns, which was different from pain. "It doesn't change anything I'm doing," she said, "which is the only part I can control." Pete nodded slowly, like she'd said something he needed to think about. He left, and Elena went back to work. And she did not write a letter to her father that night about what was being said in town, because he would worry, and worry cost him breath he couldn't afford. She did, however, add a note in her private book. "The narrative about me is useful to someone. People who are looking at my reputation aren't looking at the accounts." She underlined it twice. It was Gideon who brought her the storage manifests from the outer properties, as he'd promised, and he brought them in an unmarked leather satchel late on a Thursday evening, which she suspected was deliberate. Late Thursday was when Silas Cobb drove out to check the east property, a trip he made every week like clockwork, which told Elena two things. Gideon had been watching patterns too, and he hadn't needed her to explain why the timing mattered. He dropped the satchel on her desk and stood with his arms crossed and looked at her like a man who had decided to trust something and wasn't entirely sure how he felt about the decision. 4 years, he said. Everything I could find. She opened the satchel and started laying documents out. Did Silas see you take these? No. Is there anyone at the main office who might mention to him that these were pulled? Gideon was quiet for a second. Possibly. Then we should assume he'll know within a day or two. He unfolded his arms. Should I be concerned about that? Not yet, she said. Right now, all he'd know is that you pulled old manifests, which any owner might do for any reason. He has no reason yet to connect it to me specifically." She paused, studying two documents side by side. "Unless he's already suspicious of me." "Are you asking whether I told him anything?" "No," she said. "I'm asking whether he's smart enough to be suspicious without being told." Gideon was quiet again, and this time the quiet had a different texture. The texture of a man reconsidering something he'd been certain of. "He's smart," he said finally. "He's always been smart." "Then we should move faster than comfortable," she said. She looked up from the documents and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not distrust. Not admiration exactly. Something more complicated. The look of a man who was used to being the most capable person in a room and had just encountered a situation where that wasn't true and didn't know yet how to arrange himself around it. She looked back down at the documents because it wasn't her business what he felt, and she had work to do. He stayed for another hour. He didn't talk much. He sat in the chair in the corner of the office with a cup of coffee that went cold, and occasionally she asked him a question. What was the name of the Terrence brothers' contact? Had any deliveries ever been disputed? Had the previous accountant ever raised concerns about any vendor? And he answered each one without elaboration or qualification, which was exactly what she needed. She didn't have time for context she hadn't asked for. He seemed to understand that. When he left, he paused in the doorway. "Miss Harrow," he said. "Yes." He seemed to be assembling a sentence. "The people in town who are—" He stopped. Started again. "Whatever they're saying, I want you to know it has no bearing on why you're here or what I think of your work." She looked at him. He looked like a man who had found that sentence difficult, which she respected. "I know," she said, "but thank you." He nodded and left, and Elena turned back to the manifests, and she thought, not for the first time, that Gideon Ashcroft was a harder person to read than his reputation suggested, and that was either very good or the beginning of a new problem. She found the third layer of it on a Saturday. She hadn't planned to work on Saturday. She'd promised herself a morning where she wrote letters and took a proper walk and didn't think about numbers. She made it to 8:30 before she picked up the manifests. What she found was this. Terrence Brothers was not registered with the Territory Commerce Bureau. She'd written to the Bureau 3 days earlier under a pretext she'd invented, a routine vendor verification, the kind that a new bookkeeper might reasonably request to make sure all accounts were in compliance. The reply had come in Friday's mail, and she'd read it twice. Terrence Brothers did not exist. Not as a registered company. Not in this county, not in the next, not in the territory records she'd been able to access. Which meant every payment to Terrence Brothers, and there were 31 of them over 4 years, totaling somewhere over $3,000 on its own, had gone to a company that existed only on paper, only in the books of Ashcroft Ranch, only in documents that Silas Cobb had control over. She sat with that for a long time. A ghost company. Simple, elegant, almost impossible to catch without access to registry records. And in a territory where registry verification wasn't standard practice, and a bookkeeper might easily assume a vendor had been verified before they arrived, it could run for years without a question. She wrote it in her private notebook. Then she did something she hadn't done in the 2 weeks she'd been at Ashcroft Ranch. She made a duplicate set of records, not copies of everything. She didn't have time for that, and she didn't have a safe place to store them. She made copies of the specific documents that constituted evidence, the Terrence Brothers invoices, the corresponding ledger entries, the delivery manifest that showed the timing gaps, and the letter from the Territory Commerce Bureau. She wrote, in her own hand, a summary of the pattern with dates and amounts and the names of all 3 vendors. She folded these copies into the lining of her traveling bag behind the false bottom she'd sewn herself before she'd left home, because she had been, without quite admitting it to herself, expecting something like this. The false bottom had been her mother's idea originally, not for hiding evidence. Her mother had hidden letters from an unpleasant aunt and a sum of household money her father didn't know about. But the principle was the same. Important things needed to exist in more than one place, because the world had a habit of taking important things away from women who weren't watching closely enough. Elena was watching closely enough. On Sunday morning, she came downstairs for breakfast and found Silas Cobb already at the kitchen table, which was unusual. He was generally up and gone before the house woke. He had coffee and was reading something, or appearing to read something. and he looked up when she came in with the specific warmth of a man who had decided in advance to be warm. "Miss Harrow," he said, "you're an early riser." "Habit," she said. She made her coffee and sat across from him, and they exchanged the kind of small talk that frontier mornings produced. Weather, the condition of the East Road, whether the cold was coming in early this year. Silas was good at small talk. He had the skill of a man who had perfected the art of seeming open while revealing nothing. She matched him perfectly, which seemed to surprise him slightly. "How are you finding the work?" he asked. "I imagine it's more complicated than you expected." "I expected complicated," she said. "It's the nature of records that have been maintained by more than one person over time." "Of course." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "If you have questions about any of the older accounts, I'm happy to help. I know those books better than anyone." She looked at him. He was smiling. She smiled back. "I appreciate that," she said. "Right now I'm mostly still building the overview. Once I have the full picture, I'm sure I'll have questions." "Of course." He nodded. "Take your time." She finished her coffee and went back upstairs. And when she reached her room, she closed the door and stood against it with her heart beating harder than she would have liked. He knew. She didn't know what he knew exactly. Whether he'd noticed the missing manifests, whether someone in the outer office had mentioned her request to the bureau, whether he'd simply registered that she was taking longer than expected to produce even a preliminary accounting report and drawn his own conclusion. But the conversation downstairs had not been an offer of help. It had been a message. "I know this territory better than you. Be careful." She pushed off the door and crossed to her bag and checked the lining with 2 fingers. The papers were still there. She exhaled. Then she sat down and thought very carefully about what a woman in her position should appear to be. The answer, she decided, was overwhelmed. Overwhelmed, but earnest. A bookkeeper in over her head, working hard, making slow progress, no particular threat to anyone. Someone you could afford to watch with patience rather than urgency. She could play that. She'd been playing smaller than she was for most of her adult life. The difference was that this time she was choosing it. She went downstairs and asked Silas Cobb, in a voice that carried just the right note of mild frustration, whether he could help her understand the filing system for the East Properties 1882 purchase contracts, because she couldn't make heads or tails of the indexing. He helped her. Graciously, patiently, for the better part of an hour. He answered every question she asked, and a few she hadn't, and when he left, he looked reassured. Elena thanked him and waited until she heard the front door close. Then she went back to her office and wrote down every single thing he'd just told her, including the 3 things he'd said that contradicted what the record showed, including the one moment when he'd hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than the question warranted before telling her the 1882 purchase had been straightforward. She didn't know yet what the 1882 purchase meant, but Silas Cobb did, and he'd lied about it by 3 words and a pause. That was enough for now. She turned to the brown paper map on the back of the door. She added a new line from a date in 1882 to Silas Cobb's name, with a question mark at the end. The map was getting crowded. That was either a problem or a path forward, and Elena had spent enough time in the dark of difficult numbers to know that you didn't find out which one it was by stopping. You found out by going further in. She picked up her pen and went further in. The ranch hand's name was Caleb. He was 23, worked the grain storage at the home property, and he had the particular quality of young men who are honest because they haven't yet learned that honesty is sometimes expensive. Elena had noticed him in the first week. He was the only person on the property who consistently looked uncomfortable when Silas Cobb told the day's assignments, a discomfort he couldn't hide because he didn't know it was visible. She did not approach him directly. She was aware enough of her position to know that a woman new to the ranch, talking privately to one of the hands, would be noticed and mentioned. Instead, she made sure she was in the grain storage twice a week for legitimate reasons. The storage logs were part of the records she was responsible for, and she let Caleb get used to her presence before she asked him anything. By the 4th week, he'd started talking on his own. Not about anything important. About the work, the weather, a horse he was fond of, the food in the bunkhouse, which was apparently a recurring source of disappointment. Elena listened to all of it with genuine interest, because she'd learned a long time ago that people who felt heard would eventually tell you the things they'd been carrying by themselves. On a Wednesday in the 5th week, Caleb said, while he was recording grain weights and not looking at her, "Do the invoices you're checking go back more than a year?" She kept writing. They go back 4 years. He was quiet for a moment. All the vendors? All the vendors. Another pause. His pen was moving, but she suspected he wasn't actually writing anything. There's a vendor I've never seen deliver anything, he said, but I sign for deliveries. I've been signing for deliveries my whole time here, and I've never seen anyone from a company called Terrence Brothers. Elena did not look up from her ledger. That's useful information, she said, in the same tone she used for everything. Even, practical, undramatic. I may need you to write that down at some point, officially. Would that be... He stopped. Would there be trouble for me? She looked up then. He was young, she thought. He had the look of someone who'd been told all his life that trouble came to people who spoke up, which was often true enough to be believed. I can't promise there won't be difficulty, she said. I won't lie to you about that. But I can tell you that the alternative is that it keeps going, and eventually someone takes the blame who shouldn't. He looked at the grain sacks along the wall. Someone already did, he said quietly. Old Marcus, the man who was accountant before you. He got sick right around the time he was asking questions about some of the invoices. Some folks figured it was just bad timing. The back of Elena's neck went cold. She kept her voice level. How long ago was that? About 8 months before he died, Caleb said. He'd been here 12 years. Never had health trouble before. Elena wrote one more line in her ledger. Her handwriting was steady. She was proud of that. Thank you, Caleb, she said. Keep doing your job exactly as you have been. Don't tell anyone we spoke. He nodded and went back to his grain weights, and she went back to her ledger, and neither of them said anything else. And the silence in the grain storage had a different weight in it than it had when she'd walked in. She walked back to the house in the cold afternoon light, and she thought about a man named Marcus who had asked questions about invoices and gotten sick and died. And she thought about the fact that she was sleeping in a room in Silas Cobb's daily orbit, eating food that was prepared in a kitchen he walked through, and nobody outside these walls knew what she'd found. Nobody except Gideon. She needed to tell him. Not everything. Not yet. Not until she had it airtight. But the piece about Marcus. That she needed to tell him. Because this wasn't about money anymore, and it may never have been only about money, and a woman who'd spent her whole life being underestimated could not afford to underestimate this. She went to find Gideon Ashcroft. She did not run. She did not let her face show anything it shouldn't. She walked at her normal pace through the normal channels of the ranch's normal afternoon, and every step she took felt for the first time like it had genuine consequences on both ends. She found him in the equipment barn, talking to his foreman about spring preparations, and she stood in the doorway until he saw her, and the thing she put in her expression was small and controlled and precise. He excused himself from the foreman without explanation, which told her he'd read her face correctly, and he walked toward her, and she turned and led him outside where the wind would take their voices away from ears she couldn't account for. There's something you need to know, she said, about Marcus. And she told him, and she watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before. Not anger, not quite shock, but the specific and terrible expression of a man who has just been handed a grief and a guilt at the same time, who understands that his trust in the wrong person may have cost a good man his life. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, with a quietness that was not calm but was the shape of a man choosing to be controlled when he didn't feel controlled, "What do you need from me?" She told him. More access. The ability to work without her movements being monitored. Time to build the case without Silas knowing how far she'd gotten. And I need something from the safe, she said. If there is one. The original purchase contract from 1882. He looked at her. Why 1882? Because Silas lied to me about it, she said simply. And he's not a man who lies carelessly. Gideon Ashcroft looked out at the gray sky over his land for a long moment. Then he looked back at her with the expression of a man who had decided something that would be difficult and had made his peace with that. Tonight, he said. After 10. She nodded and went back to the house and sat at her desk and did not think about Marcus and his 12 years of loyal service and his questions about invoices and his sudden illness, because if she thought about it the way it deserved to be thought about, she would not be able to write in a straight line. She would think about it later, when it was over. For now, there was the work, and the work was all she had, and she held on to it the way you hold on to the only thing keeping you upright in a current that wants to take you somewhere you can't come back from. The 1882 contract was not in the safe, Gideon came to her office at 10 past 10 that night, with the safe open behind him and his face arranged into the careful blankness of a man who was managing something large and uncomfortable, and he told her the contract wasn't there. Not misfiled, not buried under other documents. Gone. The safe held what it was supposed to hold: deed records, promissory notes, a small amount of emergency cash, his late wife's jewelry, and there was a gap in the document sequence where the 1882 purchase contract should have been. A gap so clean it might have been there for years. Elena stood in the doorway of his study and thought about that gap. "When did you last look at it?" she asked. "I haven't looked at it in years," he said. There was no reason to. "Did anyone else have access to the safe?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "Silas has known the combination since my father's time," he said, "in case of emergency. In case something happened to me." She nodded slowly. She didn't say the obvious thing because he already knew it, and saying it would make it smaller somehow would reduce it to a simple conclusion, when what it actually was a man realizing that the 19 years of trust he'd extended to someone had been walked through like an unlocked door. "I need you to leave the safe as it is," she said. "Don't change the combination yet. If he checks it and finds it's been changed, he'll know we're on to him." "Elena." He said her name differently than he had before. Not Miss Harrow, not the formal address he'd used in the store that first day. Just her name, with a weight in it. If he took that contract, it means there's something in it he doesn't want anyone to see. Something that ties him to an arrangement we don't know about yet. "Yes," she said, "which means this isn't just theft." "No," she said, "it probably isn't." He sat down in the chair behind his desk, which was something she'd never seen him do in his study. He was always standing when she encountered him, always in motion or leaning against something, the posture of a man who didn't like being still. Sitting down like this made him look older, and something else she didn't have a clean word for: not defeated. More like someone setting down a weight they'd been carrying at arm's length, finally letting it be close enough to feel. "My father bought the East parcel in 1882, he said, "from a man named Cotter. It was a good deal. Cotter was in debt and needed to sell quickly. Silas arranged the transaction, handled the paperwork, negotiated the price, coordinated the deed transfer." He paused. "My father trusted Silas with everything, said Silas had a mind for detail that he didn't." Elena filed that away. "Was there anyone else involved in the Cotter purchase? A lawyer? A county official?" "There was a solicitor," he said. "Halford, but he died in—" He stopped. "He died in 1884. She looked at him. 2 years after the purchase." "Yes." She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to need to contact the county land registry directly. Not through the ranch, not through any channel Silas controls. I need to see the recorded deed for the East parcel and compare it to whatever was originally filed." "What are you expecting to find?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But Silas Cobb doesn't remove things from safes because they're unimportant. He removes them because they're the kind of evidence that has a different quality than accounting irregularities. Accounting irregularities can be explained. Land fraud can't." The word landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. Land fraud. Not embezzlement. Not a ghost company and inflated invoices. Something that reached back further, that had been running longer, that had a different order of consequence attached to it. Gideon Ashcroft looked at the wall of his study for a long moment. Elena watched him absorb it, not dramatically, not with an outburst, but with the particular quiet of a man who was doing the internal work of restructuring everything he'd believed about a long stretch of his own life. "Do what you need to do," he said finally, "whatever you need." She went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and wrote 4 pages in her private notebook before she let herself stop. The letter went out with the Tuesday mail, addressed to the Territory Land Registry Office under Elena's own name, requesting a certified copy of the deed record for the East parcel of Ashcroft Ranch, original transaction 1882. She paid for it from her own wages and wrote the return address as the Blackstone Hollow Post Office, general delivery, which meant she'd have to make a trip to town to retrieve the reply. She didn't want it coming to the ranch. While she waited, she kept working the surface problem, the invoices, the ghost company, the timing gaps, because the surface problem was what she could build into a clean, documented case right now, and because she'd learned the hard way that evidence had a way of disappearing when you didn't protect it in layers. She built layers. Every document that mattered existed now in three places. The original in the office where it belonged, a duplicate in the lining of her travel bag, and a third copy she'd mailed to her father 2 weeks earlier in an envelope she'd labeled household records and asked him to keep in the lockbox under his bed without opening. Her father, who had learned a long time ago that his daughter's instructions came with good reasons even when she didn't explain them, had written back to say the envelope was safe. She hadn't told him why. She wouldn't, unless she had to. The routine of the ranch continued around her. Silas Cobb continued to be helpful and warm and present everywhere. Caleb continued to record grain weights and not look at her for longer than was necessary. Pete drove her into town for supplies on Thursdays and never asked questions she didn't invite. Gideon moved through the properties with his usual deliberate efficiency, and if there was anything different about how he looked at the ranch around him now, it was subtle enough that she thought only she might see it. The particular way a man looks at something he loves when he's just learned it's been injured. The woman arrived on a Friday. Elena heard the carriage before she saw it. A good carriage, not a ranch wagon, with the sound of matched horses that were better fed and better shod than working animals. She was in the office when it came down the main road, and she didn't go to the window because she had no legitimate reason to stop working, but she heard Silas go out to meet it, and she heard a woman's voice, and something in the quality of that voice, confident, musical, accustomed to attention, made Elena set down her pen. Her name was Constance Halliwell. She was 35, a widow whose late husband had owned timber interests 3 counties east, and she arrived at Ashcroft Ranch with 2 trunks, a maid, and the specific posture of someone who considered her presence a gift to any room she entered. Elena encountered her at dinner that evening, introduced by Silas as an old family friend come to visit for a week or two, and Constance Halliwell shook Elena's hand with the grip of a woman taking the measure of something she's already assessed from a distance. "The bookkeeper," Constance said. "Gideon mentioned he'd hired someone for the accounts." "He did," Elena said. "How resourceful of him." The smile was warm and empty. "It must be such interesting work, all those numbers." Elena smiled back with equal warmth and equal content. "It has its moments." She watched Constance at dinner the way she watched everything, without appearing to watch. Constance talked easily, laughed at the right moments, addressed Gideon with the practiced familiarity of someone who had decided in advance how this visit was going to go. Gideon was polite. He was always polite. But there was a quality to his politeness that Elena had started to be able to read. A slight evenness, a careful neutrality that he deployed when he was being courteous rather than engaged. After dinner, Silas poured brandy and Constance played the piano in the sitting room, and Elena excused herself early because she had work to do, and also because she had learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is remove yourself from a room and let other people forget you're in the building. She was at her desk an hour later when she heard Constance's voice in the hallway. Not raised, but not lowered either. The voice of a woman who was accustomed to not caring who overheard. "She's not what I expected," Constance was saying. Silas's reply was too low to catch. "No, I mean, there's something deliberate about her, like she's always filing things away." A pause. "You're sure she hasn't found anything?" Elena went very still. The hallway was quiet for a moment. Then Silas said something short and reassuring, and Constance's voice moved away with him, and the conversation was over before Elena could catch the rest of it. She sat at her desk with her pen in her hand and her heart doing something irregular and unpleasant, and she thought about that sentence with the careful precision she applied to numbers. "You're sure she hasn't found anything? Not you're sure she's doing a good job, or you're sure she's trustworthy?" The specific question of whether she'd found something. From a woman who'd arrived 2 days ago and had no obvious reason to care about the state of Ashcroft Ranch's accounts. Constance Halliwell was not here for a social visit. Elena opened her notebook and added a new entry. Constance Halliwell. Timber widow. Knows Silas. Knows to ask whether I found anything. Connection to Cotter purchase? Or only to current operation? She underlined the question marks. Then she did something she'd been deliberate about not doing. She went to find Gideon. Not at 10 o'clock with propriety and tact. At 9:15 on a Friday night, which was close enough to a regular that she knew it would be noticed if anyone was watching, and she went anyway because what she'd overheard changed the calculation. She knocked on the door of his study. He opened it in shirt sleeves, which startled her slightly. She'd never seen him without his coat. and looked at her face and immediately stepped back from the door. She came in and told him what she'd heard. She repeated the sentence exactly as Constance had said it, because exact words mattered, and she'd committed it to memory the moment she heard it. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and didn't say anything for a moment. She came here with Silas's knowledge, Elena said. He may have invited her. She's not a coincidence. What is she? He said. I don't know yet whether she's a partner or a messenger, Elena said. But she knows enough to ask the right question, which means Silas told her something. He may be feeling pressure. If he's feeling pressure, he may move faster than I'm ready for. Gideon looked at her steadily. How close are you? Close enough to have a case for the financial crimes, she said. Not close enough to know everything the financial crimes were built on top of. The land registry letter could change that, but I don't know when it'll come back. What do you need? She hesitated for the first time because what she needed felt like more than a professional request, and she wasn't sure how to frame it without it sounding like something else. I need to know if you trust my judgment, she said, because what I'm about to suggest is going to look from the outside like I'm making things worse. He looked at her for a long moment. Tell me. I want to give Silas something to find, she said. A version of my work that looks like I've hit a wall. Ledger entries that suggest I've miscategorized the Terrence brothers' payments as a clerical error and moved on. Something that tells him I'm not a threat. Gideon was quiet. And the real work? Is already somewhere he can't reach it. She paused. Do you trust me? The question sat between them in the lamplight. Outside, somewhere in the sitting room, the piano was playing again. Constance, or the maid, someone with trained hands and a light touch. The music made the silence in the study feel more contained, more private. I trust you, he said. And he said it the way he said most things, without decoration, without softening it into something safer. Just the fact, laid down clean. Elena nodded. She went back to her room and spent 2 hours constructing a deliberately imperfect version of her own accounting work. Not so wrong it would seem planted, just wrong enough to satisfy a man who was looking for evidence that she'd missed the important things. She made herself look competent but limited, thorough in the wrong places. It was, she thought with a grim private amusement, the most skilled accounting work she'd done in her life, and nobody would ever know it. She left the false ledger where Silas could find it. She went to bed. She didn't sleep well, but she hadn't slept well in weeks, and she'd learned to function in the hours between 3 and dawn when her mind refused to turn off, so she used them. She lay in the dark and thought about timelines, and she thought about Caleb, and she thought about Marcus, who had asked questions about invoices. And she thought about her father in his chair with the lockbox under his bed, and she thought about what she would do if she was wrong about all of this. If the timing gaps had innocent explanations, and Terrence Brothers was a registry oversight, and Constance Halliwell's question was simple nosiness. She would be wrong in a way she could document, and she would follow the documentation wherever it led. She'd never been wrong about numbers. Not once. Not in the direction that mattered. She'd miscounted. She'd transposed. She'd made arithmetic errors she'd caught within the hour. But the larger patterns, the shapes of behavior that appeared in financial records when someone was doing something they shouldn't, she'd never misread those. She didn't think she was misreading this. The thing happened on a Tuesday. She knew something was wrong before she understood what, the way you sometimes know a storm is coming before you see the sky change. Something in the quality of the morning. The way Silas moved through breakfast with a deliberateness that was slightly off his usual rhythm. He was performing his normalcy a half-beat too carefully. She went to the office after breakfast and found it exactly as she'd left it. Almost. The false ledger was in a different position, not dramatically different, an inch to the left, maybe less. Enough that a person who hadn't arranged it with obsessive precision would never notice. Elena noticed because obsessive precision was her primary professional tool. He'd read it. She sat down and kept her face where it should be and her breathing where it should be and worked through the morning without deviation. At 11 o'clock, she went to the storage room for the supply of blotting paper she kept there, took a different route back that put her past the window overlooking the rear yard, and saw Silas and Constance Halliwell standing near the fence, too far to hear, speaking with the body language of people who were not making pleasant conversation. At noon, Caleb came to the office. He came with the weekly grain tallies, which was a legitimate errand, but he put the papers on her desk and didn't leave, which told her he had something to say, and was deciding whether to say it. She kept writing and let him decide. "Last night," he said finally, quietly, "I saw someone in the grain storage. After dark. I was coming back late from the east shed and the door was open when it shouldn't have been." She looked up. "Did you see who it was?" "It was too dark and they had a lantern behind them." He paused. "But I know Silas's walk, and whoever it was walked like Silas." "Was anything disturbed?" "The manifest book," he said. "The one I write the daily weights in. It was open to last week's entries. I know because I'd left it closed on the second shelf." Elena thought about this with precise attention. The manifest book. The record that would show, or fail to show, any deliveries from Terrence Brothers. The record Caleb had told her he'd never seen a Terrence Brothers delivery entered in, because there had never been a Terrence Brothers delivery to enter. "Go back to work," she said. "Exactly as usual. Don't mention this to anyone." He nodded and left, and Elena put down her pen and thought. If Silas had been in the grain storage checking the manifest records, it meant he was verifying what could be found. It meant he was assessing his exposure. It meant the false ledger had done its job. He thought she'd missed the key evidence. But he was still moving, still checking, still making sure the threads were tied. Which meant he was going to do something. She didn't know what or when, but a man who was methodical about his self-protection didn't check his tracks unless he was preparing to run or preparing to remove something that could still catch him. She needed to move. She went to find Gideon and instead found Constance Halliwell in the hallway outside his study, coming out of it. They both stopped. Constance recovered first, which Elena noted. The recovery was smooth, social, practiced. "Miss Harrow, I was just returning a book I'd borrowed." She wasn't holding a book. "Of course," Elena said. "Have a good afternoon, Mrs. Halliwell." She went past her and knocked on Gideon's study door, and when she went in, he was standing at his desk with an expression that told her Constance had said something he was still processing. "What did she say to you?" Elena asked. He looked at her. "She suggested that there were questions around your professional background, that a woman with her word was ambitions, might be motivated by more than honest accounting work." Elena went very still in a familiar way. The same still she'd gone in the store when Chester Vance had said what he'd said. The still of someone absorbing something that wanted to knock them sideways and choosing not to be knocked. "She said your reputation in Blackstone Hollow isn't what you've represented it to be," he said. He was watching her face carefully. "And what did you say?" Elena asked. "I told her I judge people by what I observe directly." He paused. She didn't like that answer. "No," Elena said. She wouldn't. She crossed to the chair across from his desk and sat down. The first time she'd sat in his study, she realized. And she looked at him with the directness that was, she knew, not everyone's preference, but that she couldn't afford to be without right now. "She's working with Silas," Elena said. "I don't know whether she has a financial interest in the fraud or whether she's here to manage a problem, but she came to this ranch knowing what she came to do, and what she came to do is discredit me before I can finish the case." Gideon sat down across from her. "Can she?" "She can make it harder," Elena said honestly. "People listen to a woman like Constance Halliwell. She's wealthy, she's well-connected, she's socially fluent. If she spends 2 weeks telling everyone in the territory that I'm dishonest and ambitious in the wrong ways, it affects how a judge or a county official receives what I bring them." "Then we move before 2 weeks," Gideon said. "I need that land registry letter," Elena said. "Without it, I have a fraud case, which is serious. With it, I potentially have something that changes who this ranch belongs to, and that changes everything about what Silas has been protecting." He looked at her steadily. "Go to town tomorrow," he said. "I'll arrange a reason. Something legitimate that requires you to go in person." She stood up. She was at the door when he said her name again. "Elena." She stopped. "The things she said about your reputation." He seemed to be choosing carefully. "I want you to know I didn't need to think about my answer." She stood with her hand on the doorframe. She wasn't sure exactly what to do with that. It was the kind of thing she'd spent her adult life not expecting anyone to say, and because she hadn't expected it, she didn't have a prepared response. "Thank you," she said. It came out simpler than she intended, simpler and probably more honest. She went back to her room and she sat on the edge of her bed and she let herself feel, for approximately 3 minutes, the complicated warmth of being believed by someone who had every social incentive not to. Then she picked up her pen and got back to work. She was in the office at 7 the next morning when she heard it. A shout from outside not a word, just a sound, the kind a person makes when something goes wrong faster than language can respond. She was at the window in 2 steps, and she saw 2 ranch hands running toward the south barn, and she didn't think, she just went. The scene inside the barn was this: Caleb on the ground, conscious but not fully, with his hand pressed to his head where blood was coming through his fingers, and a section of the hayloft ladder on the floor beside him. The top rung snapped, and on the edge of the platform where it had no reason to be. Elena didn't touch him. There were hands more qualified than her for the physical emergency, and they were already there. She looked at the ladder. She looked at the manifest book. She looked at the height of the loft and the way the broken rung was broken. Not worn through, not cracked by age. Snapped. The wood was pale at the break, too pale, which meant the break was recent, and the angle of the splinter told her it hadn't broken under weight, but had been weakened before weight was applied. She memorized what she saw with the same systematic attention she gave to ledger columns. Then she stepped back from the scene and went to find Gideon and told him what she'd seen, quickly and quietly, and he listened and went to the barn without a word about what to do next because he'd understood her from the first sentence. Caleb would be all right. That came clear within the hour. A cut to the scalp, a bad headache, nothing broken. I was young and he'd landed on hay and he was going to recover, and Elena stood outside the bunkhouse where they'd taken him and felt the relief of that, felt it genuinely and physically, and then felt the cold certainty that followed it. Silas had not been trying to hurt Caleb because Caleb was important to him. He'd been trying to access the manifest book without being seen, and Caleb had arrived at the wrong moment, and a man who would tamper with a ladder was a man who'd already passed a line that most people spent their whole lives not crossing. Marcus, who had asked questions about invoices and gotten sick. Caleb, who had never seen a Terrence Brothers delivery and had said so to the wrong person. She thought about who else had been asking questions. She thought about the fact that the answer to that question was her. She went to her room and checked the lining of her travel bag. The documents were there. She checked the false bottom. She thought about her father's lockbox under his bed, 4 hours away by road. Then she sat down and made herself be practical, because panic was a resource she couldn't afford to spend. She needed to get to town. She needed that letter from the land registry. And she needed to do it today, because Silas was moving now, and his moves were not the careful small moves of a man who thought he had time. She went to find Gideon, and he was already looking for her. They met in this hallway outside the office, and he said, "The wagon's ready." And she said, "I know about the ladder." And he said, "So do I." And neither of them said what the latter meant because they both already knew. She took her travel bag. She took the private notebook. She took the duplicate documents from the lining. She climbed into the wagon with Pete, and she rode toward Blackstone Hollow in the cold morning, and she looked back once at the ranch receding behind her and thought about all the ways a person could be careful and still not be careful enough. And then she turned around and looked at the road ahead. The letter was waiting for her at general delivery. She knew it from the weight of the envelope before she opened it, the official heft of certified documents. And she stood at the post office counter with Pete waiting outside, and she read it in one pass and then read it again. The east parcel of Ashcroft Ranch, recorded 1882, deed registered to Gideon Ashcroft under the sale from one Owen Cotter. And below that, a discrepancy flag noted by the registry clerk in a routine audit of 1891, never followed up on, still open. The parcel boundary as recorded did not match the parcel boundary as filed in the original survey. The discrepancy amounted to 40 acres. The 40 acres encompassed the northwest section of the east parcel, which was, Elena knew from the supply logs she'd spent 5 weeks reading, where Ashcroft's primary grain storage facility had been built in 1885. The grain storage facility that Silas Cobb managed. That Silas Cobb had always managed. That Silas Cobb moved through like he owned it. Because if the original survey had been altered, if the recorded boundary was different from what Owen Cotter had actually sold, if 40 acres had been quietly included in a deed that shouldn't have included them, then someone had falsified a land record in 1882, and that someone had access to the transaction documents, and that someone's name was Silas Cobb. And every year since then, the grain operation on that land had been paying money through false invoices to a ghost company, and the ghost company's money was going somewhere, and somewhere was almost certainly a private account that was almost certainly in Silas Cobb's name or a name attached to him. Elena folded the letter. She put it inside her coat against her body, because some things you didn't put in a bag. She walked out of the post office into the cold air of Blackstone Hollow and stood on the wooden sidewalk and looked at the town around her. The street she'd walked her whole life. The store with her father's name on it. The bank where Chester Vance would one day inherit his father's comfortable certainty that the world arranged itself for people like him. She thought about Marcus, who had been 12 years loyal and had asked questions about invoices and died of an illness that came on suddenly at a convenient time. She thought about Caleb and his pale splintered ladder rung. She thought about a private notebook and a false bottom and an envelope under her father's bed. She walked to Pete and said, "I need to stop somewhere before we go back." She went to the office of Edmund Carr, the county solicitor, who had handled small property disputes and minor contract disagreements for 30 years, and who owed her father a favor from a freight dispute she'd resolved in 1889. She sat across from his desk, and she put the land registry letter on it, and she told him, in the methodical and unhurried voice she used for presenting financial evidence, exactly what she'd found and exactly where the duplicate documents were, and exactly what she needed him to do if she sent him a specific letter that used the phrase, "household accounts settled." Carr read the registry letter. He read it twice. He looked up at her over his glasses with the expression of a man who had just understood the weight of what was sitting on his desk. "This is serious," he said. "Yes," she said. "If this is what you're saying it is, Silas Cobb has been committing land fraud against the Ashcroft estate for over a decade." 22 years, she said. The financial fraud started later. The land fraud started in 1882. He was quiet for a moment. "You understand that going against a man with Cobb standing in this county is not—" "I understand," she said. "I'm not asking you to go against him. I'm asking you to hold documents and instructions and act on them if I ask you to, or if you don't hear from me within 10 days. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back without flinching, which she suspected was what convinced him, because Carr was a man who'd spent 30 years reading people across a desk, and he knew the difference between someone who was frightened and someone who had made peace with being frightened and was going ahead anyway. He took the documents. She walked out into the afternoon and found Pete leaning against the wagon eating a biscuit and looking entirely undisturbed by anything, which was one of Pete's most valuable qualities. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They rode back toward Ashcroft Ranch in the fading light, and Elena sat with her hands in her lap and felt the specific, exhausted clarity of someone who has done everything they can do from the outside and must now go back inside and finish what they started, knowing that the person they're building a case against has already demonstrated what he's willing to do to protect himself. She was scared. She noted it again, the same honest way she'd noted it the first time. She was scared, and her father was 4 hours away, and she was riding back toward a man who had likely killed one person already and hadn't hesitated to put another one in danger. But the documents existed in 3 places now. Carr had his instructions, and Silas Cobb, for all his 19 years and his warmth and his impeccable surface, did not know that. He thought he was watching a woman who had missed the important things. He did not know he was watching a woman who had already won and was waiting for the right moment to show it. The ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun went down behind it, and Elena looked at it and thought, "I'm not done yet." She was right. She wasn't. But she was closer than anyone inside those walls knew, and that gap, between what Silas believed and what was true, was the only advantage she needed. She got back to the ranch as the last of the daylight was leaving the sky, and the first thing she noticed was that the lights in the office were on. She had not left the lights on. Pete pulled the wagon to a stop near the main house, and she climbed down with her travel bag held close to her side, and she walked to the front door at a normal pace because normal pace was the only pace she could afford, and she went inside and straight to the office and opened the door and stood in the doorway. The office had been searched, not ransacked. That was the careful part. Whoever had gone through it had taken time to put things back in reasonable approximation of how they'd found them. But Elena had spent 6 weeks in this room, and she knew the exact position of every document on every surface the way you know the arrangement of your own kitchen. The invoice stacks were 2 inches forward from where she'd left them. The supply ledger was closed when she'd left it open to the September entries. The drawer on the left side of the desk was not fully closed. a gap of a quarter inch that she never left because an open drawer caught the hem of her skirt. She stood in the doorway for a count of 10 and assessed what was missing. The false ledger was gone. The one she'd constructed deliberately. The version of her work designed to make Silas think she'd missed the important things. Which meant he'd taken it, which meant he'd wanted it, which meant the plan had worked exactly as she'd built it, except that she'd been hoping for another 2 or 3 days before he moved. She didn't have 2 or 3 days. She went to her room and checked the travel bag's lining. Documents still there. She checked the notebook. Still there. She stood in the middle of her room and thought fast and practical thoughts about what needed to happen in what order, and then she went to find Gideon. He was in the main hallway, and the expression on his face when he saw her told her he already knew about the office. "When?" she said. "Sometime between 2 and 4 this afternoon," he said. I was at the East property. When I got back, Silas told me he'd found the office unlocked and had secured it for the evening. He was helpful about it, very concerned. She almost admired it. The consistency of the man's performance under pressure was, in a different context, extraordinary. Did he take anything else? Anywhere else in the house? "The study safe was opened," Gideon said. His voice was flat and controlled. "Nothing was taken because there's nothing left to take. But I checked the gap where the 1882 contract was, and there's now a different document in its place. A supply requisition from 3 years ago." She looked at him. "He's replacing what's missing with something harmless. If we reported it, someone would open the safe and find a requisition that could have been there for years." "Yes." "He's been thinking about this for a long time," she said. "Apparently longer than I have." She told him about Carr. Told him quickly and completely. The land registry letter. The flagged boundary discrepancy. The 40 acres. The northwest section where the grain storage sat. She watched him absorb it with the same contained focus she'd come to depend on. The focus of a man who didn't let the size of a thing knock him sideways before he'd understood it. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that the hallway clock became audible. "He built a grain storage facility on land that may not legally be part of this ranch," Gideon said. 40 acres of your east parcel may have been fraudulently included in the deed," she said, "which means for 22 years the grain operation has run on land whose legal status is compromised, and Silas has been extracting money through the ghost company accounts. Potentially as a form of rent he decided he was owed, or as insurance, or both. Or as a way to fund a legal challenge," Gideon said. She stopped. She hadn't thought of that exactly, and the moment he said it, she understood it was probably right. If Silas had documentation that the original sale had been structured differently, if he had something that suggested the 40 acres had been promised to Cotter or to someone connected to Cotter as part of a separate arrangement, he could have been building a financial position to eventually contest Ashcroft ownership of the East parcel. 22 years of patience, 22 years of access and warmth and impeccable performance, and underneath it a long, slow accumulation of money and leverage. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Dining room," Gideon said, "having supper with Constance Halliwell and acting like this is a perfectly ordinary evening." She thought about the dining room, about Silas at the table with his reliable warmth, about the office with its slightly shifted stacks and its missing false ledger, about Caleb in the bunkhouse with a bandaged head and a story about a ladder. "Tomorrow," she said. "I want to do this tomorrow, but I need tonight to prepare. And I need you to do something that will be difficult." "What?" "I need you to have dinner with them," she said. "And I need you to be normal. I need Silas to have another 12 hours of believing I found nothing important." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. She could see the effort it took. Not anger, but something more grinding than anger. The effort of performing an ordinary evening for a man who had stolen from his family for 2 decades and may have been responsible for Marcus's death. 12 hours. He said. 12 hours, she confirmed. He went to dinner. She went to work. She worked through the night. Not feverishly, not with the frantic energy of panic, but with the specific, focused endurance she'd built over years of early mornings and late lamps, and the ordinary demands of a life where there was always more to do than time allowed. She made a 3rd and 4th set of document copies, organizing them into the clearest possible sequence: dates, amounts, the ghost company, the land registry letter, the timing gaps, Caleb's statement, which she wrote out formally and which she would have him sign in the morning. She wrote a complete summary document, 12 pages, in language clear enough for a judge and specific enough for a county official who might not understand accounting to follow every step of the argument without needing her to explain it. She was not going to be in a position where the only version of this case lived in her own head. Around midnight, she heard footsteps in the hallway. She didn't move, didn't reach for anything, just sat with her pen in her hand and waited. The footsteps passed the office door without stopping. She breathed. At 2 in the morning, she heard something from the direction of the grain storage, a distant sound, muffled by walls and distance, that she couldn't identify precisely. She noted the time in her notebook. At 4, she finished the summary document and set it with the rest of the organized materials. She put the complete set in an envelope, sealed it, and addressed it to Edmund Carr. She put a second set in the lining of her travel bag. She kept the originals on the desk because the originals needed to be in the office when this happened. She washed her face with cold water from the basin, put on her second clean blouse, and pinned her hair. Then she sat in the chair and waited for morning. Gideon found her at 6. He looked like a man who hadn't slept either, though she suspected he'd tried. He stood in the doorway of the office and looked at what she'd prepared on the desk. The organized materials, the sealed envelope, the summary document on top. And he looked at her face and he said, "Tell me what you need." She told him. She needed Silas in the main room at 8 o'clock, with Constance Halliwell present if possible, because Constance was a loose thread who became more dangerous if she wasn't there to witness what happened. She needed Caleb brought from the bunkhouse. She'd already sent word with one of the hands she trusted to sign his statement before 8. She needed Pete to take the sealed envelope to Carr's office and not return to the ranch until he'd confirmed delivery. "And I need you to let me lead it," she said. "However it goes, even if it goes in a direction that's uncomfortable." He looked at her with the steadiness she'd come to think of as specific to him, not the steadiness of someone who was naturally untroubled, but of someone who'd chosen a long time ago to be steady because the alternative cost too much. "It's your case," he said. "It's always been your case." Caleb arrived at 7:30, arm in a sling for the headache that still troubled him, and signed his statement with a hand that was slightly unsteady but readable. He looked frightened, and she told him directly, "You're telling the truth. The truth is the thing he can't argue with." Caleb nodded and held on to that like a rope. Pete left at 7:45 with the envelope and specific instructions delivered in the kind of short, clear sentences that Pete responded to without needing explanation. At 7:59, Elena picked up the summary document and walked to the main room. Silas Cobb was already there. He was standing at the window with a cup of coffee, and when she came in, he turned with his usual warmth and said good morning in the voice of a man who had decided to keep performing until the last possible moment. Constance Halliwell came in 2 minutes later, presumably summoned by Gideon, and she looked at Elena with the controlled assessment of a woman who was recalibrating and didn't like needing to. Gideon came in last. He closed the door. The room had a particular quality after that, the quality of a space where everyone present knows something is about to shift, and nobody wants to be the first to name it. Elena set the summary document on the table. "I'd like to go over what I found in the accounts," she said. She said it in her working voice, even, direct, without theater. "I think it's important that everyone in this room hears it at the same time." Silas looked at the document. He looked at her face. Something moved behind his expression, very briefly, too briefly to be read cleanly, and then the warmth was back in place. "Of course," he said, "I'm sure you've worked very hard." She began with the simple things, the timing gaps in the delivery manifests. She laid out 3 invoices and their corresponding manifest entries side by side on the table and showed the 2 to 3 day lag, calmly, the way she would show a student a math problem. She did not accuse. She explained. Constance glanced at Silas. It was a small glance, fast, but Elena caught it. She moved to the ghost company, Terrence Brothers. She put the letter from the Territory Commerce Bureau on the table, the one confirming that Terrence Brothers was not a registered entity. And she listed the 31 payments made to this non-existent company over 4 years, totaling $3,417. She read the amounts aloud, each one, not quickly. She wanted each number in the room. Silas said, "That's a registry error. The company may have operated under a different registration." "I checked," Elena said, "under every variation of the name in every county registry I could access. There is no registration. She looked at him. I also found that the vendor contact listed for Terrence Brothers in your files shares an address with a post office box registered to a personal account in Milford County. I can have that documentation here within the day. She didn't have that documentation yet. She'd found the address cross-referenced 2 days ago and had written to verify it, but the reply hadn't come. She was betting on it. More precisely, she was betting that Silas knew the documentation existed and that the bluff would function the same as the fact. She watched his face. The warmth was still there, but it had a different quality now, the quality of a mask rather than an expression, and she knew she'd hit something true. She moved to the land registry letter. She put it on the table last because it was the largest thing, and she had learned that you built arguments the way you built structures. Foundation first, then walls, then the thing that holds the roof up. She explained the boundary discrepancy, the 40 acres, the grain storage facility, the connection to the 1882 purchase that Silas had arranged, and the 1882 contract that was now missing from the safe it had been kept in for 20 years. The room was very quiet. Constance Halliwell had gone still in the particular way of someone who has just understood that the situation they came to manage has already moved past managing. Silas set down his coffee cup. He did it carefully, without sound. He looked at Elena, and for the first time since she'd arrived at this ranch, the warmth was entirely absent. What was there instead was something older and colder and more honest, the face of someone making a precise calculation about what was left to salvage. This is an interesting set of assumptions, he said. They're not assumptions, Elena said. The documents are here. Copies are with the county solicitor. Copies are in a location I won't name. She paused. The original question was whether the accounting irregularities were record-keeping errors. They're not. The secondary question was whether the land boundary discrepancy was a survey error. It isn't. What's left is a question of intent, and intent is a matter for the county court, not this room. Silas looked at Gideon, and Elena watched him make the choice about whether to keep performing or to try a different approach. He chose a different approach. Gideon, he said, and the warmth came back, but aimed differently now, aimed at the relationship, at the 19 years. You know me. You've known me since you were a child. Your father trusted me with everything. I know, Gideon said. Whatever she's told you, whatever she's found in those books, there's context you don't have. There are arrangements that were made for the benefit of this ranch, for your father's benefit, that never made it into the formal records because that was how things were done. With a company that doesn't exist, Gideon said. His voice was quiet and level and had something iron inside it. Silas stopped. Marcus asked questions about the invoices, Gideon said, 8 months before he died. The name landed in the room like a stone. Silas's face did something complicated. Not guilt, exactly. He'd been too careful for too long to let guilt appear on his face without choosing it, but something flinched. Marcus had a heart condition, Silas said. He was 47, Gideon said. He'd worked here for 12 years. Nobody knew about a heart condition. These things don't, Gideon said. Just the word. Quiet and final. The silence that followed was the worst kind. The kind where everyone in the room knows what isn't being said, what can't be proven yet, but sits there anyway, specific and heavy. Constance Halliwell stood up. She moved toward the door with the efficient speed of a woman who had just done a very fast calculation about her own position. Mrs. Halliwell, Elena said. She stopped. The solicitor who handled the 1882 purchase died in 1884, Elena said. 2 years after the transaction, you're the widow of James Halliwell, who owned timber interests in the eastern counties. She paused. James Halliwell's mother was a Cotter. Constance went very still. Owen Cotter sold this land in 1882, Elena said. If there was a side arrangement, if 40 acres were promised separately, as part of a private agreement, the only people who'd have standing to benefit from it now would be Cotter's descendants, which would make you not a visitor managing a problem, but a party with a direct financial interest in whatever Silas has been building toward. Constance looked at her with an expression Elena couldn't entirely read. Not fear, not rage, something more complex. The expression of a woman who'd come into this room holding something she thought was a card and has just understood it's been in the other person's hand the whole time. I'd like to speak to a solicitor, Constance said. That's your right, Elena said. Edmund Carr's office is in Blackstone Hollow. He's aware of this matter and will treat you fairly. Constance left the room. Her footsteps were measured and controlled all the way down the hall, which Elena respected even now. Whatever else she was, Constance Halliwell didn't fall apart in front of people. That left Silas. He was standing at the table with his hands resting on its surface, not gripping, just resting, and he looked at Elena with the directness of a man who has finally stopped performing. "You're very thorough," he said. "Yes," she said. "Marcus genuinely had a weak heart," he said. "I want you to know that. I didn't—" He stopped. He looked at the table. "I didn't arrange what happened to Marcus." She didn't say anything. She didn't know if she believed him. She didn't know if believing him mattered. "I moved his questions aside," Silas said. "I made sure he got reassigned to work that kept him away from the accounts. That's all." He paused. "The heart was his own business." "The latter wasn't," Gideon said. Silas looked at him. "Caleb wasn't supposed to be there." "He was 23 years old," Gideon said. Silas looked back down at the table, and for a moment, just a moment, the performance was entirely gone, and what was left was a tired old man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just put it down without choosing to. "Your father knew about the 40 acres, he said. "Not the detail, not the legal language. But he knew there was an old arrangement with the Cotter family that hadn't been fully resolved. He asked me to handle it and not trouble him with the specifics." He looked at Gideon. "So I handled it, and the handling became something else over time. That's the truth of it." The room held that for a moment. "The truth of it," Gideon said, "is that you took money from this ranch for 22 years and called it handling." Silas didn't answer. "The truth of it is that Marcus is dead and Caleb is in the bunkhouse with a bandaged head, and you're standing in my house telling me my father knew." "He did know," Silas said, and then, more quietly, "I'm not saying that to excuse myself. I'm saying it because you'll find it eventually, and better you hear it from me." Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Elena watched his face and saw the thing she'd seen in his study that first night. She'd told him about Marcus, the grief and the guilt arriving together, the reckoning with what trust costs when it's been misplaced by someone you loved. "Get your things," Gideon said. The county sheriff arrived the next morning. Elena had sent the second letter to Carr, the one using the phrase household accounts settled, the evening before, and Carr had moved with a speed that surprised her, which suggested he'd understood the weight of what she'd given him and had acted on it overnight. The sheriff was a practical man named Drummond, who read the summary document over breakfast in Gideon's dining room and asked 3 clarifying questions that told her he understood accounting well enough not to need it, explained twice. He took the original documents. He made note of Caleb's signed statement. He asked about the missing 1882 contract, and Elena told him to check the fireplace grate in Silas's room, which was where she would have put something she'd retrieved from a safe and needed to destroy, but hadn't yet managed to burn. The grate had ash in it from the previous evening. But in the corner of the grate, half burned but readable on one edge, was a piece of document paper with the date 1882 in the upper margin and the name Owen Cotter below it, and what appeared to be a notation about a separate arrangement regarding northwestern parcel boundaries. Not enough to reconstruct the document, enough to confirm it had existed. Drummond looked at the ash. Then he looked at Elena. "You knew it would be there." "I knew he'd taken it from the safe and hadn't had a private moment to burn it completely," she said. "People who are managing multiple things at once rarely finish any of them cleanly." Drummond took the ash. He thanked her in the way of a man who doesn't love thanking people but knows when it's owed. Silas Cobb left Ashcroft Ranch in the back of the sheriff's wagon at 9 in the morning. He left without the warmth, without the performance, wearing the specific stripped dignity of a man who had been many things for many years and was now simply old and found out. Elena watched from the window of the office. She didn't feel the satisfaction she might have expected. She felt tired and correct, which was the combination that finishing hard work usually produced. Constance Halliwell had already left the previous evening under her own power, with her 2 trunks and her maid, in the direction of the county seat where she would find her own solicitor and begin the separate process of sorting out what her connection to the Cotter arrangement meant for her legal standing. Elena had no particular anger toward her. She'd come to do a job and found it was already done, and she'd been smart enough to leave when she understood that. The town found out within a week. That was the nature of Blackstone Hollow. Information moved through it the way weather moved through a valley, in all directions at once, with no clear origin point. By the following Thursday, there wasn't a soul in town who didn't know that Silas Cobb had been stealing from Ashcroft Ranch for the better part of 2 decades, that a ghost company and a fraudulent land boundary had been found by the new bookkeeper, that a hand had been injured and the former accountant's death was being looked at again by the county, and that the new bookkeeper's name was Elena Harrow. She didn't hear most of this directly. She heard it through Pete, who continued to be the most reliable secondary source available to her, and through a letter from her father that contained the line, "Mrs. Greer tells me the town has been very interested in your work. I told her you'd always been good at your work." She seemed surprised. "I don't know why." She smiled at that. She folded the letter and put it in her notebook and kept working. There was a great deal of work left. The recovery of the stolen funds required correspondence with banks in 2 counties. The land boundary question had to be resolved through the court, which Gideon's new solicitor in the county seat had begun filing for. The East Parcel's operational status had to be maintained through the legal process, which meant Elena's job wasn't bookkeeping anymore. It was financial management of a ranch in the middle of a legal proceeding, which was considerably more complex and also, she found, more interesting. Gideon asked her to stay on, not in the original 6-month terms. He asked her over coffee on a Saturday morning in the plain direct way he did most things, without framing it as anything other than what it was. He needed her here, and he was asking her to continue. She said yes without a long pause, which was the most she was willing to give away about what she felt, and they went back to the work. It was 2 weeks after Silas left that Pete brought her a box from the storage room that he'd found while reorganizing the east shed, a box that had been behind a false panel in a way that made it clear it had not been placed there accidentally. It was a tin box. Inside the tin box were 2 things: a private ledger in Silas's handwriting that cross-referenced the Terrence brothers' payments with a private bank account in Milford County, which was better evidence than anything Elena had built from the outside, and a sealed letter addressed in a woman's handwriting to Gideon Ashcroft. On the envelope, in the same handwriting, was written, "To be read when the time is right. Margaret." Elena recognized the name. Margaret Ashcroft had been Gideon's wife, dead 6 years of a fever that had moved too fast for any doctor to do anything about. She'd heard her name in the background of ranch life, the way you hear someone's name in a house they used to fill, in the way space gets arranged around an absence. She held the letter for a long moment. It had clearly been stored by Silas, not sent. Whether he'd intercepted it or Margaret had given it to him for safekeeping, she couldn't know. The seal was unbroken. She put the tin box on Gideon's desk when he wasn't in his study and left the private ledger on top with a note in her handwriting. "Found in East Shed, false panel. Pete can show you the location. The ledger is what we needed for Milford County bank verification. The letter is yours." She did not read the letter. She thought about reading it, considered it for the 30 seconds she held it, which was long enough to feel the specific temptation of information inside something sealed. And she didn't. It wasn't her letter. Whatever Margaret Ashcroft had written to her husband was between those 2 people and the 6 years of distance between them. She went back to the office and back to the recovery correspondence. And she didn't think about the letter again. She thought about it at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, which was different, and which she forgave herself for because thinking about something at 2 in the morning was not the same as acting on it. Walt. He came to the office 2 days later with the letter in his hand. She looked up and knew from his face that he'd read it. He sat down in the chair in the corner, the same chair he'd sat in that first night when she'd gone through the manifests, and he held the letter in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Margaret wrote this 4 months before she died," he said. Elena said nothing, which was the right response. She said, he stopped. He looked at the letter again. She said that she'd always known he needed someone who didn't need taking care of, someone who'd tell him the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. She said she worried that after she was gone, he'd spend his time protecting people who didn't need protection and missing the point of things. He was quiet. She described, very specifically, the kind of woman she thought would be right for him. Elena looked at her ledger. She was aware that her heart was doing something unruly, and she was not going to let it show on her face. "It sounds like she knew you well," she said carefully. "She did," he said. Better than I knew myself most of the time. He paused. The woman she described, the things she listed, courage and honesty, and the particular kind of intelligence that comes from paying attention to what's actually there instead of what you'd prefer to be there. Elena set her pen down very deliberately. I'm telling you this, Gideon said, because I think you should know that what I'm going to ask you has nothing to do with this letter. She looked at him. I need you to know that I read this letter and I thought, I already knew, he said. Margaret described someone I'd already seen. Everything she wrote, I'd already seen in this office, on that fence line, in the grain storage with Caleb, in the post office in town with whatever you were carrying back inside your coat. He stopped. She didn't introduce me to anything. She just confirmed what was already there. Elena was quiet for a moment. She was trying to find the words that were honest without being more than she'd decided to give, because she was not a woman who said things she couldn't take back. I appreciate that distinction, she said finally. I mean it, he said. I know you do, she said. That's why I appreciate it. He looked at her with that particular steadiness. I'm not asking you anything today, he said. I know we're in the middle of a legal proceeding and a financial recovery and 6 kinds of correspondence, and I know you didn't come here for... He stopped again. He was better with directness than with edges. I'm telling you that I see you, what you did, how you did it, and who you are when it's difficult. I see it. She looked at the ledger on her desk. She looked at her hands. She thought about her father in his chair and the lockbox under his bed, and the letter she'd sent him 2 weeks ago that said, things are going well, the work is important, I think I'll be here for a while. She looked at Gideon Ashcroft and said, I know. And then, because she was not a woman who hid from true things, I see you too. He nodded. He stood up. He put the letter back in his coat. At the door he paused. For what it's worth, he said, Margaret had excellent judgment. She chose you, Elena said. It surprised him. She watched it land and watched him decide what to do with it, and he smiled. A real one this time, not the shape of a smile, the full thing. And he walked out. Elena turned back to her ledger. Her pen hand was completely steady, which she noted with private satisfaction. Outside the window, Blackstone Hollow's sky was doing something complicated and beautiful with the afternoon light, and the ranch was quiet in the way that a place is quiet after a long storm. Not empty, but resting, breathing, beginning the process of being itself again, which takes longer than the storm does, but matters more. She picked up her pen and kept going. The court proceedings took 4 months. Elena had known they would take at least that long. Land fraud cases moved through the territory court system with the pace of something that understood its own weight and refused to be hurried by anyone's urgency. She'd built her timeline with that in mind. What she hadn't entirely anticipated was what 4 months of a legal proceeding did to a ranch that was trying to keep operating through it, which was something between running a household during a flood and trying to do arithmetic while someone argued loudly in the next room. She managed it the way she managed everything, by breaking it into pieces small enough to handle and handling them in order. The financial recovery correspondence with the Milford County Bank took 6 weeks and required 3 letters from Carr and 1 from the county sheriff. Before the private account Silas had been routing Terrence Brothers' payments into was frozen pending the court's findings. The account held $4,211, not the full amount Elena had calculated. She'd estimated $8,000 to $12,000 over 4 years of the financial fraud alone, which meant money had moved out of it regularly into what or where the bank couldn't yet say. She told Gideon about the gap without softening it. That was the thing she'd understood about him by now. He didn't want softened. He wanted accurate, and he would deal with the rest on his own. There may be a secondary account, she said, or he spent it. We may not recover all of it. Will the land case change that? Not directly, she said. The land case is about establishing that the 1882 boundary was fraudulently recorded. If the court rules in your favor, the east parcel remains fully yours, and the 40 acres question is settled. The money is a separate matter. He nodded. He asked her if the case was strong. It's as strong as I could make it, she said. Carr is good. The evidence is documented 4 times over. The burned fragment from the grate is circumstantial, but it places the document in Silas's hands after he told you he hadn't been in the safe. She paused. The weakness is that your father's name comes up. He'd known that was coming. She could see it in how he didn't react. The stillness of someone absorbing something they'd been quietly preparing for. He's been gone 11 years, Gideon said. I know. And he can't testify and can't be cross-examined, and Carr will argue that whatever arrangement Silas claims your father authorized, there's no documentation of that authorization. The verbal claim works in Silas's defense only if the court is willing to accept the word of the accused man about a dead man's intentions. She looked at him directly. Most courts aren't. Most, he said. Most, she confirmed, because she wasn't going to pretend the outcome was certain. She'd spent enough time with real numbers to know that certainty was a luxury. He accepted that and went back to the work of running the ranch, which was what he always did with things he couldn't argue his way around. The trial itself was held in the county seat, which meant Elena spent 3 days in a room she'd never been in before, sitting at a long table with Carr on one side and Gideon on the other, and she told the court what she'd found in exactly the same voice she used for everything, even specific without performance. She showed the documents in the sequence she'd built them, walked the judge through the timing gaps and the ghost company and the land registry discrepancy, the same way she'd walked Gideon through them in the office those months ago. And she answered every question from Silas's solicitor with the particular patience of a woman who has already thought of every counterargument and prepared for it. Silas's solicitor tried 3 approaches. The first was that the Terrence brothers' payments represented legitimate services rendered through an informal arrangement that predated proper registration requirements. Elena produced the Territory Commerce Bureau letter and the 31 invoices with delivery addresses that didn't correspond to any physical location. The second approach was that the boundary discrepancy was a surveying error that Silas had flagged to Gideon's father and been told to leave alone. Carr produced the absence of any correspondence, any note, any record in 22 years that Silas had flagged anything to anyone about the East Parcel boundary. The third approach was that Elena herself was a biased party with a personal interest in the outcome of the case. She'd expected this one. She'd thought about it at 3 a.m. more than once. What personal interest? The judge asked. Miss Harrow is employed by Mr. Ashcroft, the solicitor said, and there are questions in the community about the nature of that employment. The judge looked at him with the expression of a man who had been on the bench for 20 years and had a very limited tolerance for insinuation. Is there a specific allegation, counselor, or are you asking this court to discount the testimony of a witness on the basis of rumor? The solicitor retreated. Carr kept his face neutral. Elena kept hers the same way she always kept it. The judge ruled on the 4th day. The boundary was fraudulent. The 40 acres had never legally been excluded from the Ashcroft deed. The language in the original Cotter sale included the northwest section, and the discrepancy in the registered boundary was the result of a document that had been altered before filing. An alteration the forensic examiner brought in from the Capitol had confirmed through paper age and ink composition. The East Parcel belonged to Ashcroft Ranch in full. The grain storage was on legitimate Ashcroft land. The financial fraud case was referred to the county prosecutor. Silas Cobb, sitting across the room with his solicitor, and the specific deflated quality of a man whose performance had finally run its full length, looked at the table when the ruling was read. Elena looked at him for a moment. She'd spent months inside the architecture of what he'd built, and she understood it now in the way you understand something you've taken apart completely. Every joint, every decision, every place where ambition had shaded into something that cost other people things they couldn't get back. She didn't hate him. She had no particular energy left for hate. What she felt was the exhausted recognition that a person could be capable and patient, and even, in some context, impressive, and still spend those qualities on something that hollowed them out from the inside over 20 years until the only thing left was an old man who'd been found out and knew it. She thought about Marcus. She thought about Caleb with his bandaged head. She thought about the 11 years Gideon had run this ranch, trusting a man who was stealing from it with one hand and managing it competently with the other, because Silas had been, in a strange way, both things at once, a genuine steward and a genuine thief. And the combination was harder to make sense of than pure villainy would have been. Life was like that more often than stories admitted. They drove back to Blackstone Hollow on a Thursday in late spring. The road was better than it had been in winter. The mud had dried and the ruts had settled, and the light was the kind that made the territory look like something worth the difficulty of living in it. Pete drove and said almost nothing, which was his way of saying he was glad it was over. Elena sat beside Gideon in the wagon bed and they talked about the recovery process. What came next, which accounts needed to be restructured, what the East Parcel's proper documentation would require from the Land Registry Office. Practical things. The kind of conversation that felt to both of them like the most natural thing in the world, which was itself something neither of them had expected when this started. Somewhere on the second hour of the road, Gideon said, "I'd like to bring your father out to the ranch." She looked at him. "He's not well enough to travel far." "Pete can bring him in the good wagon, slow trip, comfortable. I want him to see the place." He paused. "I want him to meet the ranch properly, and I want to ask him something." She understood what he was saying. She sat with it for a moment, not with calculation, but with the genuine complexity of a woman who had spent years not expecting this particular thing and was now being offered it by a man she trusted in the specific way you trust something that has been tested and held. "He'll like Pete," she said finally. "He appreciates a man who doesn't overspeak." "Pete barely speaks at all," Gideon said. "Papa will consider that a virtue." There was a pause that had warmth inside it, which was the kind of pause that had started appearing between them in the last month, the kind that didn't need filling. "I'm not asking you anything yet," Gideon said. "I'm asking him first, the way it should be done." She looked at the road ahead. She thought about her mother's silver watch in her bag, and the mathematics reference book with the broken spine, and the private notebook that had 4 months of evidence in it and would now need a new purpose. She thought about the way things began, not with declarations or grand moments, but with small accumulations of trust, built in difficult conditions, the way all genuinely strong things are built. "All right," she said. He nodded. Pete kept driving. The territory moved past them in the afternoon light. Thomas Harrow came to Ashcroft Ranch in the 3rd week of May, in the good wagon with cushions Pete had added without being asked, and he arrived looking smaller than Elena remembered and sharper-eyed than the last time she'd seen him, which was the particular way her father had of surprising her, his body giving ground while his mind held position. He sat on the porch of the main house in the afternoon, and Gideon sat across from him and they talked for an hour while Elena was in the office doing work. She could have done any other time, but chose to do then because some conversations needed to happen without her listening from the doorway. She found out later what was said, not from Gideon, who told her the essential parts directly and without embellishment, and not from Pete, who had not been within earshot, but from her father himself that evening, sitting at the kitchen table of the main house over coffee that was better than the coffee at the store had ever been. "He asked me properly," Thomas said. "I know," she said. "Asked if I had objections, if I thought you'd be well treated, if I had concerns about his character or his intentions." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "I told him I'd been watching his intentions from 50 miles away for 4 months, and I didn't see much room for concern." She looked at him. He was smiling, that small, tired, real smile that she'd been watching her whole life. The smile that meant he was proud of something and didn't quite know how to say it in a straight line. "Did you tell him yes?" she asked. "I told him the decision wasn't mine to make," he said, which he already knew. But he came and asked anyway, which tells you the kind of man he is. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his over and held hers, and they sat that way for a while without talking, which was something they'd always been able to do, sit in quiet together without it being empty. "Your mother would have asked him 14 questions, Thomas said. "She would have asked him 20, Elena said, and she would have known within the first 3 whether she liked the answers. "She would have liked his answers," he said. Elena squeezed his hand. "Yes," she said. "I think so too." Gideon asked her on a Saturday morning in the office, which was where it should have happened, she thought, where it had all started, in the middle of documents and lamplight and the ongoing work of making sense of complicated things. He didn't make a speech. He said what he meant in the way he always said things, and what he said was, "I'd like to marry you, Elena, not because of the ranch, not because of what you did, not because Margaret's letter said something, because I've watched you think and work and tell the truth when it was costly, and I don't want to do any of this without you." She thought about Chester Vance in the store and what he'd said about her. She thought about it not with anger, but with the particular feeling of a person looking back at a moment from a very different elevation. He'd said a man would have to be blind and broke and desperate. He'd been so certain, the way people are certain about things they haven't examined. She thought about the morning she'd accepted Gideon's offer in that same store, with the whole town listening, and how the whole town had built a story around it that had nothing to do with what was actually true. And she thought about how little any of that had mattered in the actual living of the thing. "Yes," she said. It came out simply, the way the truest answers did. He took her hand. He held it the way her father had held it across the kitchen table, with the specific gravity of something that was not casual, that knew its own weight. Then he went back to the East Parcel survey correspondence he'd been working on, which she found, later, when she thought about it, to be exactly right. Not an ending. Not a pause before the real life began. Just the continuation of the work, side by side, which was what they'd always been. The wedding was in July, at the ranch, which had been Elena's preference because she had no particular attachment to ceremony, but a strong attachment to practicality. 40 people came, including most of the hands, including Caleb, who had healed fully, and who shook her hand at the reception with the grip of a young man who had decided to respect someone and wanted her to know it. Pete wore a clean shirt, which Elena privately considered more meaningful than most wedding gifts. Edmund Carr came from the county seat and brought his wife, who was a tall, practical woman who took one look at the recovery correspondence Elena had organized in the office and said, "You should be charging twice what you're charging," which Elena appreciated more than the sentiment required. Her father sat in the best chair on the porch for the whole afternoon. He didn't attempt to stand for long periods and didn't pretend he could, and she loved him for that specific honesty about himself, which he'd always had and which she'd inherited without knowing she was inheriting it. She checked on him 3 times during the afternoon, and each time he waved her off and told her to go back to her wedding, which was his way of telling her he was fine and she should stop worrying, which was also something she'd inherited from him and was trying to do better at. At one point during the afternoon, she was standing near the fence line of the south pasture, the same fence where she and Gideon had walked all those months ago when she'd told him what she'd found, and she saw Chester Vance at the edge of the gathering. She hadn't expected him and didn't know who had included him, but it was a small enough territory that the lines between invited and present were sometimes blurry at events like this. I was standing with the cup of something and looking at the ranch with the expression of a man who was doing a calculation and not quite finishing it. When he noticed her looking at him, he met her eyes, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the grass. He raised his cup slightly. Not an apology, not quite an acknowledgement of what he'd said in the store that morning a year ago, but something. The minimal gesture of a man who understood that the world had arranged itself differently than he'd predicted, and who was, in his limited way, registering the fact. She nodded back. That was all. She turned and walked toward the house and didn't think about Chester Vance again that afternoon, because he was a small part of a story that had turned out to be considerably larger than his opinion of her, and she had better things to do with her attention. The school was Gideon's idea, which surprised her. She'd thought it was going to be hers. He brought it up in August, 3 weeks after the wedding, at the breakfast table over coffee, the way he brought up most things that mattered, without preamble, just the fact laid down and waiting. "There's the old feed storage building on the north edge of town," he said. "It's been empty for 2 years. I'm thinking of buying it." She looked at him. "For what?" "For a school," he said. "A proper one. Not the church hall twice a week. A full-time school with a proper teacher and materials." He looked at his coffee. "Caleb told me last week that his sister can't get work in the county offices because she can't do enough arithmetic for the record-keeping positions. She's 17. She's been told to go home." Elena thought about herself at 17. The invoices, the double-checking, the columns her mother had taught her to run twice. The things she'd learned not because anyone offered to teach them to her, but because she'd needed them and taken them. "Mathematics," she said, "and business records. Not just reading and writing." "All of it," he said, "for the children who need it and aren't getting it, girls especially." She looked at him across the table. This man who had walked into her father's store and seen, past everything the town had decided she was, the intelligence of the woman who'd exposed a county-wide freight fraud at 25, who had asked her to come to his ranch not out of charity, but out of recognition. "I'll run the curriculum design," she said. "I thought you might say that," he said. "I'll need to hire a proper teacher within the year. I can't do this in the accounts and the legal recovery." "You can't do everything," he agreed. She looked at him. I'm aware of that. You're aware of it, he said. You're working on believing it. She picked up her coffee. Don't push it, she said. He smiled. The full one. The school opened in November in the old feed storage building that had been cleaned and fitted with proper windows and desks that Gideon had ordered from the capital, and which arrived 2 weeks late and were the wrong size and had to be modified by the ranch carpenter, which was the way most things actually went when you were building something real. 23 children enrolled in the first month. By spring, it was 31. The teacher they hired was a woman named Ruth Alderman, who'd been teaching in a mining settlement 3 counties over and arrived with a trunk full of mathematics texts and an opinion about everything that Elena respected immediately. On the first day of school's operation, Elena stood in the doorway and watched Ruth write fractions on the blackboard for a room full of children who ranged from 7 to 15, some of whom looked like they'd been skeptical about coming, and some of whom were leaning forward already with the particular hunger of people who had been waiting for exactly this without knowing they were waiting. She thought about what it would have meant, at 10 or 12, to walk into a room where someone was teaching you that numbers had logic, that accounts could be read, that a pattern in a ledger could tell you a story if you knew how to listen. She thought about how much of what she knew she'd taught herself in the back room of her father's store by lamplight, because no one had offered to teach it to her. She was glad the children in this room wouldn't have to do that. She was glad, and also, she was honest enough with herself to name it. There was something in her that felt the particular ache of a person who arrived somewhere after a long, hard road and sees, with a complicated mix of relief and old grief, that the road for someone coming after them is shorter. That was all right. That was how things should move. The point wasn't that her road had been hard. The point was what you built with what the hard road taught you. She turned away from the doorway and walked back toward the ranch in the November morning, and the territory stretched out around her. The fence lines and the grain storage and the east parcel with its 40 properly documented acres and the main house where her father was visiting for 3 weeks and had already told Pete 6 things about how to store root vegetables correctly over winter, which Pete had received with the stoic patience of a man who did not store root vegetables and was not going to start. She walked back across the land of a place that had become, in the quiet accretion of months and work and difficult days, hers. Not hers the way property is yours. She'd never cared much about that kind of having. Hers the way a place becomes yours when you've earned your understanding of it through genuine labor, when you've sat in it at 4 a.m. with a headache and an impossible problem and refused to leave until the problem had an answer. Gideon was at the fence near the south pasture when she reached the home property. Not doing anything in particular, just standing. She'd come to understand this about him, that standing at the fence looking at his land was how he thought, the same way she thought at her desk or walking the long way back from somewhere on purpose. She stopped beside him. They stood looking at the pasture together, which was ordinary and not ordinary at the same time. "How was the first day?" he asked. "Ruth is excellent," she said, demanding. The children looked slightly alarmed. "Is that good?" "That's very good," she said. "Alarm means they're paying attention." He nodded. After a moment, he said, "Your father told Pete that the feed storage could use better insulation." "My father told Pete that the feed storage could use better insulation," she repeated. Pete seemed to feel this was directed at him personally. "It wasn't. Papa talks about insulation to everyone. It's been a concern of his for 30 years. She paused. "He's right, though. The east wall is losing heat." Gideon turned to look at her with the expression she'd come to know well, the one where he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking or the practical thing. He usually chose the practical thing, which was one of the reasons she'd decided to marry him, and occasionally he chose the other, which was a different reason. "Are you all right?" he said. Just that. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. She thought about the school and her father and Caleb's healed head, and the 4 months of legal proceedings, and the long winter she'd spent building a case in a room full of someone else's disordered documents, and the morning in the store when Chester Vance had looked her in the face and said what he'd said. She thought about what it meant that she was standing here now, on the right side of a fence she'd helped repair through honest work, next to a man who'd seen her clearly from the beginning and had kept seeing her even when it would have been easier not to. "Yes," she said, and it was true. Not perfectly, not without the complicated freight of everything it had taken to get here, but genuinely and essentially yes. She looked out at the pasture. The light was doing the thing it did in November in this territory, slanting low and turning everything it touched into something worth looking at. "The east wall needs better insulation," she said. "I'll talk to the carpenter," he said. They stood there a while longer, side by side, not needing to say anything else. The territory was big and cold and indifferent to human arrangements, the way it always had been and always would be, and in the middle of it, this small piece of ground held a school and a healed man and an old man talking about root vegetables, and two people who had found each other through the specific medium of honest work and difficult truth. It wasn't a story Elena would have written for herself if she'd been given the pen at 25. It was harder than that, and stranger than that, and more real than anything she could have invented. But then, the true things always were. The true things didn't come pre-assembled and ready to live in. They came the way the ranch had come to her. Complicated, imperfect, full of problems that needed someone willing to sit with them long enough to understand them, and then willing to keep working after they did. She'd always been that kind of person. She just hadn't known, for a long time, that the world had places for people like her. That a sharp mind was its own form of worth. That being seen clearly by even one person at the right moment could change the entire direction of a life. She knew it now. She intended to make sure the children in that schoolroom learned it before they needed someone else to show them. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was, in the end, everything.